coming into the studio, we have Akhil from Shield Capital. I'm very excited to talk to him. I talked to him
Boom.
yesterday. How you doing?
Hey, good John, good Jordy. Good to see you guys. Thanks for
What's
having me
going
on.
on?
Yeah, thanks so much for taking the time. Would you mind just giving us a little brief overview, maybe some of your history, what you're doing now, and just kind of generally how your week's going?
Yeah, absolutely. And great discussion prior to, I think, a good tee up to what needs to happen by 2027 and what needs to happen by 2049
Yeah.
when it comes to our own national industrial base. But by way of background, Akhil, yeah, from Buffalo originally, did RTC in college, wanted to go serve, had the opportunity to serve in the Marines as an infantry and special operations officer. Left my time in active duty in 2019, like many other vets, Brandon included, that you'll have here soon.
Mm-hmm.
Both amazed by the type of technology we had that the US and its allies could provide, and also incredibly frustrated by the lack of some of the basic commercial tools. And had the opportunity via some mentors to connect and help build a new fund, a new venture capital fund, Shield Capital, where our focus is this nexus between commercial technology and national security. We cover early stage, so as early as a dream in a team on day zero across autonomy, cybersecurity, AI, and space.
It's great. Jordy, you want me
I
to
mean,
mention?
I'd just be interested to get your immediate reaction to the news yesterday, and yeah, and then there's we got a bunch of other questions to go into. Did you have an immediate reaction yesterday? Our point of view, I'm sure you heard, is it's hard. Some stuff is gonna go poorly. Some stuff, some groups and companies and industries will benefit. But I'm curious what you thought.
Totally, yeah. I guess I'll reemphasize the point that I made to start off. It is we had to look at this near term, 2027, this Admiral Davidson window. For those who are familiar with it, how do we protect our interests in the Asia Pacific region, and how do we look at it in 2049 structurally, right? So tariffs, whatever you want, has immediate near term structural effects, but a lot of that's not. We are going to have the industrial base we have by 2027, right? That's not that. That's 18 months from now.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to figure out what we can do with the capacity we have. And I'm always reminded by Churchill's quote, while America might be first, the only thing worse than fighting without allies, I'm sorry, fighting with allies is fighting without them.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an aspect to that. But ultimately, how do we make the structural changes long term? So as we look at this 2049, particularly as, again, looking at this in the national security context, how do we beat and win out technologically, geopolitically against the PRC, what that structure looks like far beyond 4 years worth of tariffs.
Can you break down the significance of 2027 and why we need to be sort of like orienting our defense planning around that date? Just for obviously people in the industry, understand it, but a lot of our listeners are in other industries.
Absolutely. Well, this comes originally from Admiral Davidson, who used to, prior to his retirement, run the Indo-Pacific Command. So this is the Asia-Pacific four-star command that's really in charge of protecting U.S. interests and deterring would-be adversaries, namely the PRC, from conducting actions, whether that's Taiwan or elsewhere. And 2027 came about as this sort of potentially vulnerable moment in which we as a nation and those that are willing to support us to be ready to defend our interests. And so you'll see that a lot in the narratives, and you'll see that a lot in terms of what capabilities can we really deploy at scale and at speed to defend our interests come 2027 and that stands, obviously, that's super near term, guys, right?
Yeah.
Only so
Right
much
around
can
the
get
corner.
done within that period. And so there's this two horizons, just like any, coming from the venture world, right? You want entrepreneurs to be looking at multiple horizons, the near term one, but then also look for what that long term structural changes will be. And so that's the 2049, and really that aligns with the 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party.
Can you talk a little bit about Chinese competition with regard to robotics? There's some high flying startups in America. There's some just young hacker kids building cool stuff. A lot of awesome demos, but it feels like the financial markets aren't taking humanoid robotics as seriously in America as they are in China. Is that a mistake? What are you seeing in humanoid robotics?
Yeah, great question. And I'll tie it together with AI just
Yeah.
because there's so much intersection between
Totally.
the digital AI world and then AI applied to hardware, right?
Yeah.
I grow increasingly concerned that we are just frankly behind
Yeah.
in terms of the model development, the application of hardware, and the synthesis therein, both from a hardware standpoint, from the software standpoint, and then critically the ability to test.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, part of it is just let's get the things out there. As a prior Marine, I'll always remember, we get taught in sort of military history class, the French had better tanks when World War II started, but who tested them better?
Hmm.
It was the Germans, right? They just
Mhm.
got them out there and they just started testing with them and experiment them at a pace and scale that was far greater than anyone else. And so you see this environment now, and a lot of the things that need to happen are actually regulatory in nature, right? How do we reduce the barrier for folks to actually go out and test either all sorts of robotics applications, right? It doesn't actually have to be pure humanoids. It can be autonomous systems too. And then how do you combine that with actually getting some of these deployed, at a scale that you need to? The last point I'll say specifically around robotics and autonomy is that I don't think, well, let me say, from a capital deployment perspective, I think there's a real interest and you had some folks come on last week when we talked about defenses,
Yeah.
is being willing to make some really big bets
Mhm.
and be able to provide the necessary capital to help them deploy at speed and scale. Obviously, we're an early stage, small fund to start off with. We have big dreams, but we want to be a part of that journey, particularly if that journey is here in the U.S.
That's very cool. Can you talk a little bit about logistics and just how can we increase resiliency there, and what startups are kind of tackling that, or how should they even think about tackling that?
Yeah, great question too. Let me start framing it by I look at the defense national security space, and again, we at Shield we think pretty broadly when it comes to national security, right?
Hmm.
So that is anything that touches autonomy, AI, cyber, and space that has an application to both.
Hmm.
When I think about the national security context, it's how do you sense, make sense, affect, and sustain.
Hmm.
Sense is easy, right? That's satellites like Topher came on, one of our portfolio companies, right? He's sensing the environment and making sense of it. How do you affect it? So what are you actually going to do about it? And that could be something physical, that could be Brandon and Shield AI drones, or that could be non-physical, digital in nature.
Hmm.
And then there's a sustainment part. And I think this is just such a huge opportunity. There's a lot of companies working on it and so much more to do. And I specifically call it sustainment, not logistics, for a couple of reasons. One, this term of contested logistics, while important, doesn't get to the root of the issues, which is how do you both operate in a constrained environment? So how do you do things when you know you're going to run out of fuel or you're going to have these certain constraints? And then how are you going to sustain it more broadly, not just from a physical movement? So there's two aspects. There's a very physical hardware component to it. We need just more munitions. We need more capacity here to do it. Knowing though, back to the two horizons, by 2027, we may not have all of that. So you just need to be able to digitally operate and be more efficient with the things that you might have now or within 18 months.
Yeah.
And so I think there's just so many opportunities here in terms of how you deploy at the edge. So what capabilities do you decide to go produce, in the edge being some location where it's just easier to get to? How do you combine the two together? And then how do you use artificial intelligence to actually optimize it all?
Hmm.
How do you think about 2027 as a wedge for new defense tech, companies that are emerging? A lot of companies come in and they're just focused on legacy systems. Like, I want to build a better version of this missile, and I think I'm going to be able to get a contract because the DoD doesn't want extreme vendor dependency on like one or two old primes, versus looking at 2027 in Taiwan and saying, hey, we want to build a capability for this specific potential conflict. And is that an opportunity, or is that not even the right way to think?
Yeah, I mean, a lot needs to happen in 18 months, right? But that's not the only timeline. I thought you brought up some great points in the group that came last week about, trying to build a feature within the defense space. There's only gonna be so many Andurils, right?
Yeah.
There's only gonna be so many that can speed and scale. Now, do I think there's more opportunity to do so? Absolutely. That's why we're in this business. It's not the only business, though.
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of enabling features to your question. Some of the most interesting things that I found from, say, the conflict in Ukraine weren't necessarily the missiles and drones. It's how did they move their administration to a digital environment using outposts and snowballs to actually make sure that the state functions, right? And you wouldn't necessarily think that it's like core national security, but to me, that absolutely is, right? Half the challenge with a lot of the AI applications is you don't have the models accredited, you don't have the models deployed in a way that they can actually be used. And obviously, that has a compounding advantage the more times you can get hardware, the software, and the data together. But directly to your question, I mean, I still think there's a ton of room, right? There's a really unique moment in time, especially now with the desire to want more startups within the ecosystem My colleague just testified to the Senate panel with regards to cyber reform. So how do we actually use our small business innovation research dollars to actually incent not necessarily just small business or ones that are churning that through, but the ones that actually want to go and scale it and go scale to something bigger, like a traditional pilot program should be.
Can you talk a little bit about Edge AI? We've seen like the Studio Ghibli moment. We've passed the Turing test. Waymos are driving around. Like, is there something that we've seen those drone shows that seem like, okay, that's a weapon system. What AI kind of Studio Ghibli moments are we waiting for in defense? Is there anything that you're excited about in Edge AI?
Yeah, with you guys at Founders Fund, we're
Yeah.
invested in a company together called Armada.
Yeah.
And it's really kind of giving me a new glimpse into what not just Edge, so Edge being where am I going to deploy compute? Again, go back to the makes sense of the environment, but how am I going to connect together with some cloud-based, right? It's always going to be some disaggregated network there. But what I'm excited about is, I mean, there's just so much that can be done with smaller models and with reasonable compute, knowing that we're only going to get so much compute. And we talked about tariffs earlier, right? There are those bottlenecks that exist. We're not going to produce the best in semiconductors overnight. And so we have to be able to do more in those environments. Anduril is an early pioneer at that, right? In the national security space. How do you bring computer vision and other aspects of sensor fusion with other modalities together? And that's just only the start. So I'm super excited by that. And I think it meets a lot of the customers where they're at, not just for national security, right? People are worried about cloud bills. People are worried about how much, like, what am I actually getting for AI return on investment with all the compute that goes into it?
Yeah.
Do you think there's enough private capital going into defense tech broadly? There's been talk of, we've seen over the last year investors that have no background in national security, sort of FOMOing into the category, but maybe that's actually good for America because we just should have more private investment coming in.
Yeah, I guess let me first say, I'm glad that there's more people interested. I mean, I don't think you need to have a military background to do this. I think there's amazing American patriots that just want to get involved and they have really core technical skills elsewhere. I think it's helpful that, folks came from the visceral operating experience, but that's not necessarily necessary. Nor arguably is that why you should go pursue that path, right? Go serve because you want to go serve and you want to go defend the nation. It just so happens that I came out of that experience having some really, interesting insights that I thought I could go leverage and go help out, within the space, and be able to support. Actually, most importantly, I love when non-military, non-national security, just amazing entrepreneurs and technologists just want to go tackle these problems, and we're able to help them out. I'm not the best when it comes to, what's next in computer vision or distributed models, but you know what? I can help you find the right customer set or identify the right contract vehicles. That's what our fund does. And so that part's actually most exciting is how do you get, the folks who may go to Snapchat working on, some background filter to actually work on some like really cool problems within national security space that have the same technical aspects.
I think our audience is probably familiar with the idea of like, if you're starting a defense tech company, you might start with some SBIR money, then you're kind of sprinting towards program of record. Maybe there's the valley of death where you have something that's working, but you're not ready to really start producing it at scale. What are the other pools of revenue that defense tech entrepreneurs should be thinking about? And can you give us a little more granularity or sense of scale of how should I be thinking about an SBIR? How should I be thinking about a program of record and everything in between?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll keep it quick because I know we're on a clock here. Let me give you a financial answer and a non-financial answer. And
Cool.
I think both are important.
That's great.
The first is right. It's not just SBIRs and program of record, right? And you saw the Secretary of Defense's memo around use of the newer software acquisition pathways and specifically other contract vehicles or other transactions to help facilitate this. And that's exactly what organizations like Defense Innovation Unit are there for. So there's this middle ground that I think is being tapped now far, far greater by the new entrants within the national security space. I'll give you a non-financial answer too. Sometimes an unpaid pilot is super helpful.
Oh yeah.
Going on a CRADA, which I think Saronic and others had done in the early days, access to data, access to testing environments is just as important, particularly for those within the autonomy space, right? That need to go test and validate, get access to the right data, or just have ranges where you have at least a little lower barrier to entry when it comes to flying, certifying, et cetera.
That's great. Last question.
No, this was great.
Wrap up. Yeah, this is
Super
awesome.
helpful.
Thank you so much for stopping by. We
Yeah,
really
it's great to have
appreciate
you.
it.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for
Get
having me
back
on.
Yeah,
to
we'll
it.
have to have you back on soon. Thanks so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, I would love to.
Cheers.
We'll talk to you soon.